of this sphere lesson. If you haven't watched part one, go back and do that. And this kind of starts off with this one sphere that we've created with highlights, reflective light, shading, base color, contact shadow, cast shadow, and we have a background in here. This is going to apply basic atmospheric perspective, what I call science, the science behind the atmosphere of the earth and how it affects objects in real life as they go further away from a point of view, and how that science can be applied to any kind of artwork, in this case digital artwork, to give a more realistic effect of objects going back into space. So we start with our sphere. I'm going to utilize folders to take all of my sphere objects, not my wall. I can even delete this background layer. I'm going to put them in a folder. I'm going to then duplicate this. Oop, you can't see it, it's off of my page, but if you have this highlighted, you can hit duplicate group, and I'll call this middle ground. And then I can duplicate that as well and call this foreground. Oop, and I spelled it wrong. Let's spell this correctly. Again, I'm using a drawing tablet. This is not a mouse. The more you utilize a drawing tablet, the more a mouse will actually feel like you're trying to draw with a brick when you're on a computer. So this is to get your wrist, your hand moving, your hand-eye coordination with that tablet. All right, we'll call this one background. And we're just going to make sure we have all three of these with background. Again, spell it wrong. At the furthest away, middle ground, and foreground. So notice as those shadows stack up, they are putting those multiplied shadow layers on top of each other, so that's why it looks so dark. So now we're going to go ahead and move them into their places. So this background, make sure that you have auto select. If you have auto select on, it'll end up moving like whatever you're touching, which is kind of more of an Illustrator feature. Photoshop did not used to have this back in the day. It's kind of nice. So make sure you have that off so that you, and then highlight your layer. So whatever layer you have highlighted, you're going to have to do a lot of this back, forth is what layer is going to be moved. So my background layer, I'm going to move over here. My foreground layer, I'm going to move over here. Middle layer, let's kind of actually move it more middle. Okay. So that's just our very basics. Now we're going to apply all these things that are kind of the basic atmospheric perspective to make it look like these things are going back in space. First thing we're going to do is scaling. Obviously, the further away it is, the smaller it's going to get. So I'm going to click on background, Command T with my left hand. And I don't have to hold Shift because Photoshop's changed that. And I'm going to scale this down. I'm going to scale it down about 50%. I'm looking up at the top of the page. Actually, I'm going to do more like 60%. I'm looking up here in my control panel. And I'm just going to place that over here. Next, I'm going to do my middle ground. Same thing, Command T. I'm going to scale that down. Now the science, I clearly know the number was 60%. So if I'm going to break that into half, I could do around 80%. Remember, a little bit of this is math and science. It's the actual logistical way this occurs. So we can leave that like that for now. You can always use your arrows. Sometimes I click over onto my arrows and hit return. So now I have the three objects, so they are starting to move back in space. Now if you change your mind and you want them to move a little more, that's fine. Just change them. We're going to actually, I'm going to move this guy even further now that I'm seeing it so that I can really show a much bigger distance change. I want them to overlap just a little bit for now. And we're going to actually take down, I'm going to take down this even more. So I'm going to go down a little bit further. So he's even smaller. Hit return, go to my middle ground, transform him even further. There we go. I don't want them to overlap, really. So right now it's weird, right? Because we've got this background, first of all. We can go ahead and drop that wall. We can scale this up. If you hit shift, you'll be able to just pull the top up. And we can also go in and make a little bit of a gradient. We'll do that towards the end. We've got the scaling, so contrast is the next thing. Objects that show less and less contrast as they move further away. So all those darks and lights need to be turned down on this guy. Easy. Go into background, grab our cast shadow and shadow layers, and let's turn it down to 50%. Not bad, doesn't give us a huge change. Let's turn it down to 25%. Definitely closer. Let's go into our middle ground, and again, we're going to back, forth. And let's turn this down. If we did that one at 25%, let's think somewhere in the middle of that 70-ish percent. Nope, not darn enough. Let's go to 60. Really more like this 35%, much paler. You really want a big difference. I mean, you want to be able to see this difference, right? We're going to go to this background one, and we're going to make it even more pale. We're going to turn it down to just barely to 10%. Okay, still looks too bright. Now it looks like it's floating, which is obviously strange. We're going to turn this shade down to 10%. It loses its contrast. You're going to see less and less as this gets further away of the object's shape. Okay. So the other thing we need to also address, let me go back to middle ground, turn that shade down. So we turn these to 30. I could have grabbed these at the same time. Turn this guy down. And I definitely want him to show a little more. So I'm going to eyeball it just a little bit more to about 50%. That looks good. So now it's not just, its contrast gets less. So it's not just the darks, right? So you want your highlights to get turned down too. So let's turn this down a little bit. Aim for that 50, not bad. Let's go back to our background. Leave that guy open. And we will look at that 10%, but it looks like that's going to be way too pale. So we're going to leave him pretty close to 20%. Now notice, so less contrast, less lights, less darks. Okay, so that's that basic science, and they are starting to move back a little bit. We still have to address our shadow issue, so that's fine, we'll fix that. The next thing is color saturation. As they go back into space, they're less saturated. Great. So let's go into our base color, image up in the top, the menu, and go to adjustments, hue saturation. Turn down that saturation. Now be careful. You can turn it down. It's going to turn to gray. That's kind of weird, right? So let's turn this to, let's say 30 and hit OK. And then let's go up to this guy and do the same thing because we're using this as our base. Like this is our most, and we're kind of going back into space. Adjustments, hue saturation. Learn these shortcut keys. So Command U would have got me there really quick. And I'm not going to turn this all the way down to 30 because that would make it the same as the one behind it, but a little bit. So let's try 10. And that definitely gives me a little less look. 11, that's fine. Okay. Good. Hue, color, Hue is the next important thing. As things get further back, they get more blue. So the sphere in the background should have a little bit of blue, and the sphere in the middle should have a hint of blue. So one way to go in and do that, you have to be very careful with this. Can I add a little bit of blue? You're barely going to see a change in this. I'm going to add 10. Type it in to get it exact and hit OK. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to try 5. Tiny bit, great. And now notice if you kind of blur your eyes, you do start to see it go just the tiniest bit black back to blue. Okay, the other place that you can add even more blue in, like if you're really trying to show a strong atmospheric perspective, we could go in here to cast shadow. I'm in the background layer, and we could look at adjustments, and we could look into even putting some blue into this shadow. Again, you're not going to see it. If you go way over here, you're not really seeing anything happening, but it's there. I'm just going to add a little bit. We'll say 17 is fine. So there is blue as it's going back into space. Even our reflective light on this. So right now our reflective light was that orangey color reflecting from the ground onto the object. So instead of having that, we could even put a little bit of blue into this reflective light that's right here. Again, barely seeing it. Just doing the science behind it. Okay, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to do the same thing with these. I'm going to Command U to get that over quickly, the hue saturation window. I'm going to tip it up to blue just the tiniest bit so that it's there, but we're not really noticing it. A little bit more. And we're going to do the same with reflective light. Command U. Drag that hue into the blue zone just a little bit because it's there, but we're not seeing it a lot. Okay, so the next thing we definitely need to address before we finish with clarity, clarity meaning the further it gets away, the blurrier it looks, right? Everything's crisp, more in focus as it's closer, and as it gets further away, it loses some of its clarity, some of its focus. So we also need to address the shadow shape. So let's go into here, and on this cast shadow, let's grab our brush, make sure we've got a nice fluffy brush, make it bigger with the brackets, and run our background. So I'm just doing a little bit here, and I'm just going to reshape because remember this went up a little bit because there was a wall there. We're not showing a wall on this one. It's kind of reutilizing. I can paint black on this mask to get away the shadow. Got my opacity turned up big time, and I'm just going to work on that. Now what I'm also going to do is hit these edges with it really soft so that that edge gets even more faded. Notice how it is. Okay, you can always go back and change that by painting white. I'm going to go to my middle ground and I'm going to start to do the same thing. I'm doing a lot of brush strokes because I have my flow and opacity turned on. I want it to go slowly. And I'm just kind of going back and forth between a large and a smaller brush so that I can get it to look the way I want depending on my presets of my brush. Not bad. I've maybe gotten too much gone, so I can always my colors. I need to open up my color window. There we go. So I've got black. So I could always pop it back up to white if I needed to, and paint, make sure I'm in the right layer, and paint some of this mask out if I wanted to bring a little bit back. This is going to darken a little bit. Okay, not bad. I have 3 very distinct sizes. And now I even need to apply that to my foreground. Rearrange those, come down to my cast shadow, and I want to paint this out. So make sure I'm back down with black as my foreground color because that's what masks it. And I want to get rid of this shadow. And having those all on separate layers is what really helps me not mess each other up. There's a lot more organizing. You got to kind of think about what you're doing before you do it. And there we go. Okay. Now we have 3. Perfect. And if at any point you're kind of looking at these and you think, I really want this middle one to be just a little over more, that's fine. Rearrange. Okay, so a couple more things. As they get further away, they obviously get more faded. I'm going to move this guy back even more, and this guy back even more. So as they get faded back, they're going back in space. I'm going to go ahead and change my ground layer. Some of this is based with the science, so I'm going to paint it actually. So I've got this orange. If you hit Option, you can get your exact color of orange back in your colors panel. And then if I want to do it a little bit lighter, because that's just more intuitive to me, I kind of want it to fade back, right? It's losing its saturation of this orange color as it's going back into space. That's about the color I want to paint it. And then you can come over here and start painting. And notice how immediately that starts to give such a bigger interest in this going back. And I want full color up here, so I'm just painting because I've got my flow turned on. I could have turned it way up, that's fine, but then it's so quick, it kind of makes me nuts. So I want to paint that in easier, slower. Using my brackets with my left hand, right bracket makes larger, left bracket makes smaller. There, I've got a nice painted in gradient, which I like. Now, I want to turn down the screen just a little bit. It's still too bright for me as I'm looking at it. And then while I'm there, I'm also going to blur the edges. So the sphere color, I want to get in. I just want to look at my adjustments a little bit more. Ooh, not those. My hue saturation. And I just want to turn that down a bit more, and I want to lighten it to also help get out some of that contrast. Just a little bit. Now notice that picks up even more. If you kind of blur your eyes, it looks a little bluer. It definitely looks a little paler. It's lost its contrast. Its hue saturation has that hint of blue. Okay, and then while I'm here, I'm going to come over and I'm going to grab my blur tool. And I'm going to zoom in. Sometimes this takes a second to really notice it. And I'm going to blur out this sphere in my background. Give it a minute. That blur takes a second on your computers. Okay, now I need to do a little bit to that middle ground. Just a little bit. And I actually want to go back in just like I did before and just kind of barely adjust this lightness too. So I liked the way that helped this one set back even further. Okay, now I'm going to do just a little bit of blur, but I'm going to turn it down like 50% of strength. Give it a second to think. And now you'll notice it has just a hint of blur applied to it. Now you got to kind of look, make sure you've gone through the science. You've chipped away at what needed to scientifically happen to each of these. Now, as I'm looking at this green sphere on this lighter background, I need to turn down the brightness and color even more. It needs to fade even more into this paler orange, and it's more noticeable since I adjusted the background. So I'm going to go into my background layer, and you'll have to do this with anything. It's like do the science, then adjust to make it perfect. Okay, I'm gonna U, and now I'm adjusting here, but I'm looking here. And I want this even more pale, even less saturated. Give it a second. It's definitely getting there. What happens when I make it even brighter? That's kind of ridiculous. I'm going to bring it back down, and I'm just trying to get that really farther object to look even further. And now notice how much the blue hue even picks up. Okay, and I'm going to do a little bit of that also with this because I just really want to show very strong atmospheric perspective. So I'm going to lighten him just a tiny bit more. I'm going to saturate him just the tiny bit less. And now I have a pretty extreme case showing atmospheric perspective between these three different spheres. Let's go look at what levels do. Command L. I love to look into my levels. And bring in some lighter. There we go. That's the lightness I'm really wanting. So you can only get so much through that saturation hue. What I'm doing is kind of blurring my eyes and making sure that this line, this difference is less. I want it to be less. So I'm trying to slowly, instead of just abruptly going through it, slowly chip away at the science of it. And get that in there brighter and showing this atmospheric perspective. Okay, awesome. I'm going to hit save, and now you have kind of walked through the science of atmospheric perspective and how to apply that to actual objects to make your artwork look like it's going back into space. Good job.